Hi everyone. Today I found a video on the Warfronts channel. It is titled Indonesia is Burning, Here's Why. Thought it was very interesting because this is probably the first person outside of Indonesia that seems to have a fairly accurate view of what is going on. I feel like it's quite common for, people within the geopolitical space when they're talking about the Indonesian situation. You often find that they're either extremely pro the West, and in that way they are completely against the current government. And then you have on the other side people that are a bit more pro Russia, pro China, who seem to believe that everything that's going on in Indonesia is almost like a color revolution with intelligence forces behind it. I think this guy has a very interesting perspective because me being somebody who's in Indonesia, I do know how easy it is to fall for the fact that everything might be fabricated or created by intelligence services. But I think this guy points out a few things that make it less likely so. So let's have a watch.
On Monday, the 25th of August, long simmering tensions in Indonesia finally bubbled to the surface. Thousands took to the streets of Jakarta to protest against what they saw as a government intent on enriching itself at the expense of the ordinary people. The protesters, some carrying pirate flags from the anime One Piece, had one target in their sights: Parliament. 1,250 police officers were deployed to guard the building and were soon engaging in running battles with angry demonstrators. On one side, tear gas and water cannons were deployed. On the other, angry citizens were lighting fires and hurling rocks. Little could anyone have guessed that these scenes of carnage were only the beginning. In the days that followed, the protests swelled, transforming what began as a local outburst into a national movement that experts have described as the greatest test for President Prabowo Subianto. The scenes coming out of Jakarta are grim. Protesters have been killed, buildings torched, politicians' houses have been looted, and thousands have been arrested. If recent history is any indicator, things will only get worse before they get better. So, how did Indonesia spiral into this crisis? And is there any way out? Tensions have been high in Indonesia since President Subianto's government introduced massive spending cuts in February to fund his signature free nutritious meals program. The cuts and subsequent unemployment exacerbated an existing cost of living crisis. To make matters worse, local governments began imposing higher property taxes to address the budgetary shortfalls caused by President Subianto's cuts. There was also
Just to note as well, the new project that he set up to provide free nutrition to students at school, it's supposed to be for lunch primarily, has been widely criticized. There are a lot of people that have complained about the food quality. A lot of food poisoning cases have occurred. And it has taken up a significant portion of the budget, which has resulted in cuts all around. And for some reason, when it comes to the benefits that are given to politicians, they have not been cut. In fact, they have been increased. So this is definitely one of the reasons why people are quite angry.
a lot of anger after the government pushed through a controversial amendment to allow serving military officers to hold crucial civilian posts. The amendment raised fears that President Subianto, a former army general and son-in-law of the former dictator Suharto, was dragging the nation back to the dark days of military rule. So, you can imagine the outrage when, amidst these conditions, Indonesian parliamentarians started receiving a monthly housing allowance of 50 million rupiah. That's approximately $3,000 in addition to their salaries. The allowance.
And just to point out in regards to the military being allowed to have civilian posts, I think locally, even though that might seem like a thing that's very negative in the West, I think locally, people didn't have as much issue with that as they're making it seem overseas, certainly. I think this is more of a problem, the increase in salaries, and certainly a cut to the budget for all other social benefits. Having all those funds diverted over to that nutritional meal given to school children. So that is definitely more impactful than the military being allowed to hold civilian outposts, posts. Sorry, and that's my opinion. Again,
introduced last year is, according to Al Jazeera, almost 10 times the Jakarta minimum wage and about 20 times the monthly minimum wage in poorer areas of the country. And these figures may even be on the low end. According to analysis by the Indonesian Forum for Budget Transparency, an NGO that carries out oversight of the state's budget, parliamentarians may now be taking home 230 million rupiah monthly. That's about 13,940.
this is also another point. So 230 million, he's saying that it could be up to. It's actually completely incorrect. So this is actually still the low end. So every parliamentarian gets about 450 million rupiah a month. And that's called dana aspirasi, which is, it literally means aspirational funds. And so they're given close to $50,000 Australian, so $45,000 Australian a month for aspirational purposes, theoretic aspirational purposes. And that's outside of their salary. It's considered a tunjangan in Indonesian, which essentially just means like, I guess the funds that you're allowed to use. Overseas, it would be the case that if you don't use the budget, you probably have to return it. But this is not the case. They get to keep it, and it's called aspirational funds. So theoretically, it's quite meaningless. But so this is the low end. So you can understand people's anger. It's not 10 to 20 times the amount of a local's minimum wage. It's more along the lines of they're receiving 40 to 50 to maybe even more times the minimum wage per month within the country.
$40. For most Indonesians, the issue wasn't how high the figure was, rather it was the sheer audacity of politicians rewarding themselves at a time when ordinary citizens were struggling to survive. And we mean survive. Just days before this news broke, a story went viral on Indonesian social media of a 4-year-old girl called Raya who died from tuberculosis exacerbated by malnutrition and roundworms. The fact that a child could die of malnutrition while those in government enriched themselves made the whole nation not just angry, it made them livid. Like, really livid. Unfortunately, it was onto this smouldering flame of public outrage that Indonesia's MPs decided to pour an industrial quantity of gasoline. Responding to the growing controversy, Abigail Lemuria, co-founder of the digital media platform WhatsApp Indonesia, claimed that one MP dismissed the vast gulf between their salary and those of ordinary people by saying, "Wait for it, do not compare us to the commoners." And you said the quiet part out loud, my dude. What the hell are you doing? Another MP...
This is so true. So in Indonesia, corruption is not something that is new. It's something that has existed for a long, long time. And it's always been the case where as long as Indonesians weren't aware, as long as their politicians were humble, kind, pretended to care, it never was a problem. But now things are getting so out of hand where politicians essentially have no shame and they say the quiet part out loud all the time, where they're not, their position will be, wakil rakyat, which means a representative of the people. But it's very clear that they view themselves not as the representative of the people, but as a leader of the people, or not essentially one who holds power. That's how they view themselves. And it's really, really entrenched within the local culture over here that the president doesn't serve you, he's the one in power. The ministers don't serve you, they're the ones in power. Now, there are people these days that are falling for they're supposed to be representatives of us, and they're not doing their job because they're ruling over us and corrupting and all that. And this is sort of a shift with the younger generation and how they think, because they really are falling for the democracy, story. But anybody would tell you that realistically, Indonesia is not a democracy. It's dominated by political parties. and they divvy up positions for the sake of power. And this here is one of the more powerful parliamentarians who has been widely criticized recently. His house was ransacked as well.
Ahmad Saroni described those who were calling for the dissolution of Parliament in response to these exorbitant perks as, quoting here, the dumbest people in the world. Those people who voted you in, by the way. While most commentators point to the allowance as the main cause of the people's anger, Abigail believes that it's the arrogance from public officials more than anything else that drove people to the streets. And they soon hit the streets in the thousands. On Wednesday, the 27th of August, protesters in West Kalimantan province, led by the Tanjung Pura University Students' Council, marched to the regional parliament demanding an end to the housing allowance. At first, the protests were peaceful, but after the police fired tear gas into the crowd, the demonstration erupted into violence. 15 people were arrested, but were released 2 days later after signing a pledge promising not to repeat their actions. At this point, most of the protesters were either students or members of labor unions. While the rest of the nation was angry at the members of parliament, they hadn't taken to the streets yet. That would all change on the 28th of August. Now, before I tell you about the 28th of August, I have to introduce you to a man named Afan Kurnawan. Afan was a motorcycle taxi driver who worked for Gojek, an on-demand multi-service platform and digital payment technology group. He lived with his family of 7 in a rented house in the Menteng area of central Jakarta and was the household's main breadwinner. According to information shared by Katadata, a digital media, data and research company, Afan worked as a security guard before joining Gojek, which he viewed as a more flexible job that could better support his family. You'll notice there that we're speaking about Afan in the past tense, and that's because he died during the protests on the night of the 28th. And it would be his death more than anything that turned the white-hot anger of the protesters into a nuclear inferno. Initially, the day started calmly enough. Protesters, mainly students, political activists, and labor union members, led by labor groups such as the Coalition of Labor Unions and the Labour Party, had gathered in Jakarta with a list of demands for the government. At the top of their list, they wanted an end to outsourcing, a practice in which companies hire workers through third-party agencies on short-term contracts, denying them protections, wages, and stability that full-time employees receive. They also want...
Now, so... this is a demand from the union groups. So there are a few groups that are a part of these protests. They're not just all from one group. There are students. There are just the general population, people that are out of work. And then you have the unions who are still at work, but they are complaining about the labor conditions. And so they have their own set of demands. So that's why it can get a bit murky as to how you actually go about solving this, because there are so many different parties involved. But certainly, I think there needs to be a bit more cohesiveness on the part of the protesters to, list their demands accurately so that we can have more of a benchmark as to whether or not the government fulfills their promises of, answering those demands. Currently, there is a list going around of 17 plus 8 demands, of which I'm not sure if the outsourcing is a part of it. We will have to see.
The minimum wage to be raised, for mass layoffs to end, and for labor taxes to be reformed. Outside of Jakarta, protests with similar demands occurred in several major cities, including Surabaya, Medan, Mojokerto, and Gorontalo. The Jakarta protesters marched to Parliament, and at first things were peaceful. Tensions only raised, and some of the students tried to break into the building while others threw objects. Police responded as they always do, with friendly words. No, they didn't. They used tear gas, high-pressure water cannons, and rubber bullets. But rather than disperse, the crowd only became more enraged. Clashes spread from the Parliament complex to a nearby shopping district, onto a major expressway and railway line, disrupting public transport and causing closures of the Palmera and Tanah Abang train stations. Hundreds of students were arrested, and those who managed to escape withdrew to the Angola Protestant Christian Church in the Pejompongan. It was through this chaos that Afan had the misfortune to come while fulfilling a delivery. By the time he reached the area, the police had already called in the Mobile Brigade, the Special Operations, Paramilitary and Tactical Unit of the National Police Force. Driving a 4x4 armored vehicle, one member of the brigade plowed straight into Afan. What happened next would be captured on 1,000 viral videos. Although the vehicle stopped after hitting him, it then sped away as an angry crowd formed, once again running over Afan. According to an eyewitness, the young man had tried to get to his feet, but he never stood a chance once the driver hit the gas. Afan was rushed to a local hospital where the doctors pronounced him dead at 7:50 p.m. local time. Another online delivery driver, Mo Amar Umrudin, was also hit by the Mobile Brigade unit, and according to local news outlet Detik News, was in hospital nursing his injuries.
Just to note as well, Afan Kurniawan wasn't the only death that occurred during the protest. There were, I think, around 8 to 10-ish. But he is definitely the most notable because after his death being, recorded on a viral video that was, widely spread, that's what led to the escalation, for sure.
Afan, Mo wasn't a protester. He was at work, fulfilling a delivery. The reaction to Afan's death was immediate. The protesters chased down the tactical vehicle before encircling and trying to storm the Mobile Brigade's headquarters. That they were unsuccessful only added to their anger. A hashtag that roughly translates as "Police, the People's Killer," quickly topped social media in Indonesia. One commenter, Verdika Rizki Utama, compared Afan's death to the 1989 Tiananmen Square massacre in China. Writing in Compass, a national newspaper published in Jakarta, Verdika posited that Afan's death was not an accident, but rather part of a systemic pattern of repression by a government that wields the police as a cudgel against dissent. He urged the police.
So this is complicated. I think this is a bit of Western propaganda spin, to be honest, to call it Tiananmen Square, or to draw parallels between what happened and Tiananmen Square. But it certainly is the case that the police in Indonesia are very heavy-handed in their approach when dealing with protesters, and it stems from this mindset that I mentioned earlier, where those that hold power believe that they are rulers as opposed to representatives of the people for the people. And again, this is very cultural, so I doubt this is going to be changing anytime soon. It's also I'm not sure if he's going to go into it, but it's worth noting that after this occurrence, the police did not seem very serious in wanting to investigate and punish the officers involved. Rather, they were saying that likely that's what they needed to do, and I can understand that point of view as well, obviously, because if you this is the thing, right? The police that are on the job, they're not in charge of policy. All they're doing is reacting. And when they see things get, out of control, their job is to, make sure that justice and stability is brought back into it, right? So it's tough. You can't really blame the police for doing what they had to do. But at the same time, their heavy-handed approach, you can definitely blame it on their superiors, as well as maybe, the executive branch, potentially. So I think the way that they're going about it needs to change, and we're starting to see those changes now, slightly, but I'm not sure if it's completely enough. We will have to see.
To stand up against government oppression because no one was safe, not even a delivery driver just doing his job. Afan was buried on the 29th of August, escorted by hundreds of motorcycle riders. The government, realizing that the funeral could become a flashpoint, sent a representative, the chief of Jakarta Police, Asap Edi Sahari. And while you could imagine a universe in which a representative of the force that killed Afan attending his funeral was all chill, in this universe it very nearly led to a riot. What followed was damage control on steroids. President Prabowo Subianto appeared on television expressing sorrow for the delivery driver's death. The defense minister, Sejafri Sejamsodin, did a photo op, gifting Afan's family a house. But you know how the narrative sometimes gets away from politicians, leaving them forever about 24 hours behind the curve of public opinion? Well, that absolutely happened here. As stand-up comedian Panji Pragiwaksono declared, Indonesians will no longer accept dialogue. We're now angry. You cannot dialogue with someone who is angry. The following days saw massive protests across the entire country, from Banda Aceh in the west to Manokwari in the east. Buildings were torched, including one in which 3 people reportedly burned to death. In response, the president directed the armed forces and police to take firm action. Soon after, the chief of police authorized the use of rubber bullets and non-lethal weapons on anarchists entering police bases and dormitories. Hundreds of university students staged a demonstration outside the National Police Headquarters demanding the removal of the Chief of Police. Made Supratma, visiting fellow at Singapore's ICS Yusof Ishak Institute, believes that removing the Chief of Police is one of the easiest things that the president can do to calm down the public. If I were
So this is a very good point he made here. And I agree with this person who's speaking here, Made Supriyatma. So when, like, the easiest thing you can do when a situation comes out like this, where the police have been seen to act very heavy-handed and it has resulted in a death, the easiest thing you can do is essentially remove the head of police and replace him. And usually that is sufficient to appease the the populace. But what we are seeing is the president appears to be somewhat beholden to the police force, which is, as an Indonesian, it's not surprising at all. So within Indonesia, the police force, they're very, very powerful. They control, everywhere in the world, what the police can control, right? Like they control, law and order, they control drugs, they control, they have authority their authority is quite wide ranging. And if they decide to not engage in their work honestly, you will find that there are a lot of opportunities for them to make money. And if there are not, enough protections within the country to ensure that that doesn't happen, it's pretty much guaranteed that that's what will happen. Just like how public-private partnerships are essentially corruption, here you have, essentially private drug dealers making deals with police to not catch them, and then the police might order them to pay a protection. The usual stuff that you would expect to happen if there are no controls in place. And so this is what we're facing now. The president has, I believe he doesn't have the power to go ahead and fire the head of police. I believe the head of police is quite powerful in his own right. And so what he has done instead, in my opinion, is he's given the head of the military as well as the head of police instructions to, as quickly as possible, restore law and order. And if they are able to, then they will be freed, from any issues. But if not, that's when essentially he would be looking to punish them. Again, overseas, this would be seen as crazy. But in Indonesia, this is, I want to say, widely accepted, in the sense where it's a public secret. Everybody knows that this is how things work, but it's not the way things should work, and it's not the way things work on paper, but it is the way things work in reality.
President, I'd remove the national police chief from his post. The people need a symbolic gesture from him. The fact that the president still hadn't removed him from office at the time of recording, Tuesday afternoon, even after the death of a second protester, Reza Sendi Pratama, at the hands of the police, it seems to have confirmed the demonstrators' worst fears. Many Indonesians view this as emblematic of the deeper rot within the system, a government more concerned with preserving its own power structure than with delivering justice or restoring public trust. And so we come to the next major part of the protests, the part where the angry citizenry try to dispense justice themselves. On the 31st of August, crowds stormed the home of Finance Minister Sri Mulyani, stealing electronics, jewelry, and even a basketball ring. Soon after, they attacked the home of Ahmad Saroni, Remember him? He was the guy who called those upset by politicians' pay raises the dumbest people in the world. Well, his home was looted, and his sports car was destroyed live on TikTok. Oh no! In what has to be one of the fastest cases of instant karma in modern history. Nor were Cerrone and Mulyani the only ones targeted. Celebrities also had their property ransacked, including Surya Atama, who had all 12 of his cats stolen by...
This is a bit of false information. Maybe the person who is doing the video isn't aware, but the reason why this person had their property ransacked is because he was a celebrity previously. He is now a parliamentarian. So he now sits within the parliament, and he's a part of this whole thing. So he didn't get ransacked for being a celebrity or anything like that. No, he's got a political party now. He's in there. He's got a parliamentarian seat, and he is one of the people who has been deemed as disrespectful by the local population. Now, I don't know what he did exactly, but there are a lot of things that he says that may come across as arrogant. And that's probably the reason why.
The rioters. Okay then. By September the 1st, it was estimated that at least 6 people had died in the riots, with another 20 going missing. But September the 1st also brought something unexpected, a moment of tense calm. Fearing a police crackdown, the All-Indonesian Student Executive Board, BEMSI, a student organization that had been at the forefront of organizing the protests, withdrew plans for an evening demonstration. Speaking to Compass, the organization's leaders indicated that plans for further protests were still on the table, but they were dependent on the security situation. As of the time of recording, an eerie sense of calm seems to have returned to Jakarta, underscored by the fact that members of parliament went back to work on Monday. Many Indonesians have been left asking, well, what's next? What did the protests actually achieve? Well, according to Gavin Butler, a reporter for the BBC, it's unclear where the protests will go from here. On the 1st of September, several high-profile social media figures published a list of demands named the 17+8 demands in tribute to Indonesian Independence Day, the 17th of August. They were directed at various government institutions and divided into 17 short-term goals to be fulfilled by the 5th of September 2025 and 8 long-term demands to be fulfilled by the 31st of August 2026. While we won't go into every single one, the 3 most important short-term demands, in our opinion, are number 1, the removal of the armed forces from civil law enforcement and ensure no criminalization of protesters. Number 2, freezing the pay raise and perks to the representatives and cancellation of new facilities. And 3, an end to the police brutality and for the force to adhere to standard operating.
So this guy is extremely wrong about this. And this is where I feel like the Western propaganda is coming into play here. The absolute most important demand that is short-term actually has nothing to do with the military holding civilian positions. Again, I think that this is Western propaganda because that is what they don't like the most. And not criminalizing protesters, yes, that's true. There's hundreds, I don't even know the actual number, but I know it's probably more than 400 now, of people that have been taken by the government since these protests started. Even when the protests have stopped, they have gone back and looked at footage of people ransacking the houses and such, and they have gone and caught all those people. So it's very funny because the parliamentarians that are involved in corruption that have caused these protests to begin with, they had their houses ransacked, and where the government has trouble helping the average person, look for their stolen bike, for example. The police can't help with that. You usually have to pay them a ton of money, and there's no guarantee that you're going to get your bike back because they're not interested. Yet, one of these parliamentarians has their house ransacked, and within a few days, they're catching everybody involved. So a bit of hypocrisy there, and it's not lost on the people. But the main demand, I'm going to go back to this, sorry to go around in circles, but the main demand that the protesters want in the short term is they want a law passed called the RUU Perampasan Aset. And basically what that means is it's an anti-corruption law. And it's a law similar to China, where in the sense, if you get caught for corruption, they are going to seize all your assets that were from that corruption. Now, right now, how things work in Indonesia is if somebody gets caught for corruption, they get put in jail, but they're not actually in jail. They have a ton of money that they've corrupted with. They don't have to pay that back. And so their children or their family members or whoever else is involved with the corruption, they sit outside and they ensure that every single month there's a payment to the facility, to the prison, so that they can be freed. And essentially, these people, every weekend, they can go home. Sometimes even more than that. So you'll find that these people that are in jail are technically not in jail, right? I have no opinion about that, to be honest, right? Because, I mean, you don't know how the law works over here. A lot of the times, you know, people that are wrongfully accused get thrown in jail as well. And so you can't really say that everybody deserves to be in there. But certainly if you do get in there, there are ways for you to play the game so that you don't have to be in there full time and you have free time, or you can have a phone, or you can have a TV, or you can upgrade your room. There are many facilities that all cost money, essentially, right? And if you're catching people that have corrupted, they have a ton of money, they don't have to return it. Essentially, they're just going on a long holiday where they might not be allowed to be seen by people, but they can do whatever they want, right? And this is what they want to stop. This is what the local population wants to stop. They want to make it so that it is so taxing for people to corrupt that people wouldn't dare anymore. And that, I think, to be honest, that if the government were to pass that in the short term, I think that would pretty much, it would take the wind out of the sails of all the protesters. I think at that point, there wouldn't be much that they could complain about, because if they're if they fully believe that in future corruption will be dealt with properly, I think I don't think that it would have much reason to go onto the streets anymore.
Procedure on demonstrators. The most important long-term ones, meanwhile, are number 1, implementing fairer tax reform, number 2, strengthening the National Commission on Human Rights and independent watchdogs, and number 3, leadership and systemic reform to the police forces to achieve more professional and humanist policing. At the time of writing, the government hasn't responded to the 17+8 demands. However, the president recently announced that Indonesia's political parties had reached a consensus to reduce lawmakers' benefits. What isn't clear is when the perks will be reduced, or whether the decision will be enough to address the deep-rooted class issues in the country. It is the depth and breadth of these issues that has given the current anti-government rallies such force and set them apart from the many other protests that Indonesians have launched in recent years. In the view of Vedi Hadiz, professor of Asian Studies at the University of Melbourne's Asia Institute, this makes them, and we'll quote them here, among the most significant outbreak of protests since the advent of reformasi, end quote. These are the reforms that followed the dictator Suharto's downfall in 1998. In other words, they're a once-in-a-generation upheaval. This sentiment is echoed by Dr. Eve Warburton, director of the Indonesia Institute at the Australian National University, who told the BBC, quote, "The current demonstrations are different. The grievances run deeper and are likely more broadly felt. The protests reflect people's sense of economic insecurity and pent-up resentment toward the greed and excesses of their elected officials." In the end, these protests have exposed a profound tension at the heart of Southeast Asia's largest economy. What happens next is going to depend on whether the Indonesian government treats this crisis as a passing storm or as the Category 5 hurricane that it truly is. If the ruling class now do the hard work of stormproofing their home, addressing the entrenched inequality and deep-seated anger it has inspired, then maybe they'll survive the next downpour. But if they simply trim a few salaries here and try to carry on without some serious work on the foundations, well, then they might find that the next gust of public anger is enough to blow the whole rotten edifice away. Thank you for watching.
I definitely agree. So it's definitely the case that if things don't get a proper answer this time around, it may be the case that they kick the can down the road a little longer, but it's not going to last. Not just from the case of the people have had enough, I think that's part of it. But I think the fact that the economy is doing so poorly is definitely the reason. That's the primary reason. Because if everybody was doing okay where they could survive, I don't think people would be complaining as much. But the whole point is the problem of Indonesia's corruption has finally gotten to the point where it can't really be ignored. It's a sort of public secret, and everybody knows this in Indonesia. The growth of the economy is likely completely fabricated. And it used to be the case that predominantly the economy was actual, actual real capital flows that were building the economy. Whereas now, I would I would argue that maybe above 50% or close to 50% of the entire economy now is money laundering. And it doesn't take much for you to go in Indonesia and look at a bunch of expensive shops, cafes, and you can see that they're usually empty with nobody inside purchasing anything. And sometimes with the rents that they have at these malls, it's impossible to see how a business that makes like one sale or two sales a month, pays wages, is able to survive and still pay the rent at the mall. And so the reason why that is, and the reason why so many cafes they open and they're very extravagant and expensive, like in their fixtures and stuff, and they don't make any money back and yet they still remain open, is all money laundering. So they don't care if they're making money or not, as long as it looks that way, because that's the way that they need to be perceived in order to run the money through. And so you're finding that a lot of people that actually operate businesses can't compete because they're after a profit. They have costs that they need to cover. And then you have them competing with businesses that don't care about costs. They just need to make it look like they're having turnover so that they can run as much dirty money as they can through it. So a lot of the actual businesses are going bankrupt. And a lot of the businesses that are thriving are all ones based on money laundering. So Indonesia is in a very tough spot right now. I'm not sure how things are going to progress from here, whether or not they get more negative or positive. Hopefully the latter. But I think that in order for the latter to happen, there needs to be more of a response, a proper response from the government to sort of appease the demands of the protesters. Anyways, that's my point of view for now. Thanks for watching the video. I want to hear what your thoughts are on Indonesia, whether you think this is going to turn into something a little bit more violent or a little, get out of control, escalation, or if you think that this is sort of going to, simmer and then sort of cool off. Interested to know perspectives from all around the world, because certainly we all shared. We don't all share the same perspective. Also, please like if you enjoyed the content and subscribe to get notified of any future videos.